The purpose of this screencast is to read and think aloud the article Winning the Vote, A History of Voting Rights by Stephen Mintz. Before you even start reading, or before I start reading, I highly recommend you go and read the questions. So while you hear me read aloud and while you're following me while I read aloud, you can have these questions in mind. They are at the bottom of the article. A good tactic before one reads is to make sure you preview the reading. And I know that this is winning the vote, so this is about voting rights. I can guess that it's going to have something to do with how who gets to vote has changed over the years in the United States. So voting rights on the eve of the revolution. So I know it's going to start all the way back from the beginnings of the country and the American Revolution and the impact the revolution has on voting. Then the Constitution and voting rights. So the Constitution comes into play and maybe changes that. And then we have political democratization, which is where maybe the voting rights are expanding or getting more democratic. More voices are being heard. And then it leads to the questions. So, if you are listening to this screencast and this Think Aloud, please follow along with the reading. Do not just simply listen. In other words, read the words as I read them. That helps you better understand what's being read. Winning the Vote, A History of Voting Rights by Stephen Mintz. Part 1, Voting Rights on the Eve of the Revolution. The basic principle that governed voting in colonial America was that voters should have a stake in society. Leading colonists associated democracy with disorder and mob rule, and believed that the vote should be restricted to those who owned property and paid taxes. Only these people, in their view, were committed members of the community and were sufficiently independent to vote. Each of the 13 colonies required voters either to own a certain amount of land or personal property or to pay a specific amount in taxes. In other words, to sum up this paragraph, it was believed that open democracy or democracy was mob rule. In other words, if all the people were participating in forming the government, it was a mob rule, it was disorder, it was chaos. So to get away from that, we should only have those people vote that have a stake in society, and those are those people who own property and pay taxes. At the time, it tended to be upper class white males. Many colonies imposed other restrictions on voting, including religious tests. Catholics were barred from voting in 5 colonies and Jews in 4. So, if Catholics and Jews are being excluded from voting based on their religious beliefs, we can probably imagine that most voters, not only now are white males with property, but also Protestants. The right to vote varied widely in colonial America. In frontier areas, 70 to 80% of white men could vote, but in some cities the percentage was just 40 to 50%. So this tells us that out on the frontier area or the areas where less people lived, out in the wilderness or in farms, you had more males, white males, able to vote, whereas in cities you had a far less percentage of people were able to vote, probably because you had a lot more immigrants and people that didn't fit those requirements living in cities. The impact of the Revolution. The American Revolution was fought in part over the issue of voting. The revolutionaries rejected the British argument that representation in Parliament could be virtual. That is, the English members of Parliament could adequately represent the interests of the colonists. Instead, the revolutionaries argued that government derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. So, when the revolution came along, this really important idea of the government exists for the people, and therefore the consent of the governed gives government its power. So the governed are the people. So more people should be participating in government, and that's primarily through voting. This made many restrictions on voting seem to be a violation of fundamental rights. During the period immediately following the revolution, some states replaced property qualifications with tax-paying requirements. This reflected the principle that there should be no taxation without representation. Other states allowed anyone who served in the army or militia to vote. Vermont was the first state to eliminate all property and tax-paying qualifications for voting. So, in this particular paragraph, it's talking about how some of the restrictions on who gets to vote are being lifted, like if you pay property taxes, which essentially means you own property. So now you're beginning to expand the vote to people that maybe did not own property. So things are already changing from colonial times as we start the new country. By 1790, all the states had eliminated religious requirements for voting. As a result, approximately 60 to 70% of adult white men could vote. During this time, 6 states, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Vermont, permitted free African Americans to vote. So, by 1790, just 10 years after the Revolution, roughly, you have 60 to 70% of adult white males voting, and you even have in some of the northern New England states free African Americans voting. And I would imagine those were males. The Constitution and voting rights. The U.S. Constitution left the issue of voting rights up to the states. The only thing that the Constitution said about voting was that those entitled to vote for the most numerous branch of the state legislature could vote for members of the House of the Representatives. So, the Constitution had very little in it about voting rights, which is somewhat important because this is the major document that is enforced and protected and where all laws are contained. But it does say how there should be a lot of participation of people voting for the state legislature so that it represents the voice of the people. Political democratization. During the first half of the 19th century, the election process changed dramatically. Voting by voice was replaced by voting by written ballot. This was not the same thing as a secret ballot, which was instituted only in the late 19th century. Parties permitted ballots on colored paper so that it was still possible to determine who had voted for which candidate. So this tells you that we moved from voice voting to now written ballots, but early on you still knew who a person was voting for based on the color of the voting chad, or the card they were holding with the candidate's name on it. So it wasn't secret at this point. You were giving away who you voted for. Of course, now it's secret, so we'll see how we get there. The most significant political innovation of the early 19th century was the abolition of property qualifications for voting and office holding. Hard times resulting from the Panic of 1819 led many people to demand an end to property restrictions on voting and office holding. In 1800, just 3 states, Kentucky, New Hampshire, and Vermont, had universal white manhood suffrage. By 1830, 10 states permitted white manhood suffrage without qualification. 8 states restricted the vote to taxpayers, and 6 imposed a property qualification for suffrage. In 1860, just 5 states limited suffrage to taxpayers, and only 2 still imposed property qualifications. And after 1840, a number of states, mainly in the Midwest, allowed immigrants who intended to become citizens to vote. So we're seeing that the grip on who gets to vote is being loosened, and all throughout from about 1800 all the way up to, it looks like the 1860s, you're getting more universal white man's suffrage, so you're having white males are voting without property restrictions. And even in states out west, like perhaps in Minnesota, in the Midwest, and in the western states, you're even having immigrants who intended to become citizens vote. Pressure for the expansion of voting rights came from propertyless men. from territories eager to attract settlers, and from political parties seeking to broaden their base. So a lot of political parties were seeking to broaden their base, and one way to do this was, well, put the power of voting in those hands of those people who didn't have it before. So a lot of political parties tried to attract people that otherwise were left out of the process, and this built their base or expanded their base and made them more popular. Ironically, the period that saw the advent of universal white manhood suffrage also saw new restrictions imposed on voting by African Americans. Every new state that joined the Union after 1819 explicitly denied blacks the right to vote. In 1855, only 5 states, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Vermont, allowed African Americans to vote without significant restrictions. In 1826, only 16 black New Yorkers were qualified to vote. So we see that even as it's expanding for white males, the right to vote is decreasing for African Americans. The era of universal white manhood suffrage also saw other restrictions on voting. In New Jersey, the one state that had allowed women property holders to vote, women lost the right to vote. 12 states forbade paupers from voting, and 24 states excluded felons. A pauper is a poor person, a felon is somebody who committed a crime. After 1830, interest in voting registration increased. There were also some attempts to impose literacy tests and prolonged residence requirements ranging up to 21 years in the 1850s. So, we see that other restrictions have been placed on voting. At one time, women were able to vote, but that was removed from them, and that was in New Jersey. And then at one point, there were several states that didn't allow poor people or criminals to vote. And then in the 1830s, we see that registration increased, and we also see that literacy tests and living in a state prolonged residence, means living in the country for a long time, were also restrictions placed on voting. So now you want to take to these questions, and you want to answer these using complete sentences, and you want to use a different color when answering them. All the answers to these are contained in the reading. All right, thank you for listening.